Thank you very much, Asger. I'm deeply honored to be inside of this building that I've seen a few times from the outside, and to be in this distinguished with this audience. So I'm also, of course, extremely honored to be half Norwegian, like Asger has said. So I really feel like coming home, being here. And I think the topic of today's meeting is extremely relevant, and actually the reason why I moved back to Denmark a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, from a nice job in the US. Moved back to work with the transition of shipping in the context of big societal change, and moved back also to explore if we could establish an effective way of collaborating with the ecosystem, bringing academia, authorities, industries, NGOs together to create a vision for where we want to go, and to create also some of the fundamental concepts and solutions that would enable this transition to actually play out. So what we heard this morning was, I think, a set of really fascinating contributions and discussions about the complexities of this big picture that we have around us and that we all live in, and these multiple systems that need to play together. What we're trying with this exercise is to take a small portion of that, a vertical, if you will, international shipping, and see how can we activate decarbonization of that vertical in a lot of complex societal systems. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I go into that, I started this exercise about a year ago with my 2 kids that are now aged 22 and 25. And I said, in 2024, we're going to have a climate neutral Christmas. And we started joking about that, and we thought that sounds like a really good idea. So everything we will be eating, everything we will be giving each other will be climate neutral. And you can start to do this exercise with your families and friends, because I think it's a very relevant exercise to not, don't save it all. We don't need to do this 365 days a year, but let's have 1 or 2 of these every year and just try it out, what it looks like. And I think we more or less came to the conclusion, that if we wanted to do that, it would probably look like something like this, and it wouldn't even be truly climate neutral, because you can start to ask a lot of questions to this one as well. But reality is that today, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the cars we drive, the energy we use, none of that is actually climate neutral. So the change we're looking at is enormous, and I think we heard very good examples of that this morning, that it's so many things that need to change. It's not just engineers having to crank out a few technical details and then we're done. It's so many systems that have to change. And the clock is ticking like crazy. The consequences are increasing every day of the climate change, so we really, really have to get going. So when we look at shipping today as this narrow vertical across all the systems, you're looking at global infrastructure. These ships are everywhere on the globe, and this picture nicely illustrates where the emissions are coming from. And you can see that it's on some rather discrete areas of the world, but nevertheless, it's basically all over, providing infrastructure, enabling us to live the lives we live today with global supply chains that are completely distributed. Shipping is very effective in providing this infrastructure to the world. It enables these supply chains to really be optimized from economy today, from a business perspective. You can cut a pineapple in Costa Rica, take it on a ship to China and can it, and sail it back to Europe and buy it for less than €1. I mean, How crazy is that? It's unbelievable that we have these kind of supply chains. But that's nevertheless the case. And shipping has enabled that, being extremely cost and energy effective. We have about 100,000 commercial ships on the globe today. They burn about 300 million tons of fossil fuel today, so it's 99.6% fossil driven today. They emit obviously about 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalents, which is about 2 to 3% of the global impact, depending on how you're counting, but in that order of magnitude. Ownership of the shipping world is extremely fragmented. You like to think of shipping as the big owners with 1,000 or more ships. In reality, the average size of a ship owner is 5 to 10 ships, something like that. It's also important to mention that even if it is very fragmented, we have one big thing keeping our industry together, and that is the need for safety and environmental protection. And that has been acknowledged since some of the big disasters in history, and therefore we have an international maritime organization under the UN, which regulates a large part of international shipping today. So we have a body where industries and authorities are meeting once a year, or multiple times a year, to agree on what are the big issues that should be regulated in international shipping. And so you all know that the safety regime with lifeboats, etc., after the Titanic accident, there's a lot of these big developments that have actually been driven with global regulation. So that's good to keep in mind. So then let's look at some of the things that are happening in our industry at the moment. And let's start with the ship owners. And some of the examples are shown here, and actually in Norway, there are a lot of other very nice examples of initiatives being put in place. So today you will see some ship owners, and if you think about it, we have about 10,000 ship owners in the world. I would say that you probably can find between 10 and 100 that are doing something about it, right? So it's in that order of magnitude we're looking. But some of these ship owners are actually showing really nice examples of how we can decarbonize shipping. So for example, here on this shelf, can we electrify some of the offshore supply vessels? With MSC and CMA CGM, we have seen them putting LNG propulsion system on board their ships, and they have tested out running on biomethane, so that significantly reduces the climate impact from these ships. And they claim they're going to go this way to source even more biomethane, maybe electromethane, maybe ammonia in the future. So these ships are in the water. Many are now considering to build ammonia-driven ships. The engines are in the test bed. The first tug is sailing in Tokyo Harbor. The big two-stroke engines are now in the final testing phases, and it's looking very good. And the first big commercial ship will be in the water in 2026. So that is ongoing as well. Maersk, A.P. Møller Maersk, the big shipping liner company with container ships, they have built a number of ships that can run on methanol, and they have sourced the first amounts of methanol, and these ships are now in the water running on methanol. A number of other ship owners have followed on, and so it's about 200 ships now that are able to run on methanol, or soon coming into the water being able to run on methanol. So you can see this is starting to happen. But of course, if you look at the bigger picture, then to be a little bit blunt, this is anecdotal. This is small scale still. But it's indicators that it is possible to actually do it. And this, of course, is extremely important in a transition, that you can demonstrate physically that it's actually possible to decarbonize. I didn't talk here about the energy and fuel side, but I'll get back to that because there are nice examples there as well of developments happening. But then if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, then like I said, we are emitting in the order of 1 gigaton of CO2 today in 2025, a little more. And that is pretty much on the same level as we've had for the last 20 years. A lot of energy efficiency technologies, bigger ships, slower speed have been implemented in our industry. So it's pretty much decoupled from a growth of about 40% of our industry. So that's kind of nice. But if you look ahead, then there's just no way that the same means of energy efficiency can take our industry down towards zero. So we need to find new ways of bending the curve and getting our industry on a trajectory down towards zero by 2050. And what can do that? Well, like we heard this morning, it's basically a few things. It's energy efficiency by technology or operational measures. It's new fuels, and it's possibly carbon capture and storage in one form or another. So that's really what we're looking at. And if you look at the timeline here, it's 25 years, which is pretty much the lifetime of a ship. So already now we need to think that all the ships we're building today, they need to be part of this future. So the asset lifetime here, combined with this timeline, is really starting to become a challenge. But the good news is that many ships today are built. In fact, more than half of the ships that are built today, they have dual fuel capabilities, with this in mind that in the future they need to run on new types of fuels. So it's a challenge, but from a techno-economic point of view, it's not an impossible challenge. When we look at the transition again from the top perspective, it's fair to say that you look at sort of transitions that have happened and that are ongoing. It's natural to sort of divide them into phases like we've tried here, with a starting point, an emergence phase where solutions are beginning to emerge, and then this diffusion phase where you kind of come past an inflection point, and this is now how the industry starts to scale. When you build new assets, when you retrofit your ships, etc., this is how we do business. And right now we are claiming that the maritime industry is down between the cement and the steel and the aviation industry, down in the beginning of the transition where solutions are emerging. We can see it, how this could play out, but they're not really scaling yet. We haven't reached this point of this inflection point where this is the new way of doing business. Of course, to understand that, that's a system. That's many different components of this system that need to play together. And we have tried to describe this with these 7 dimensions here, where we're saying that in order for this new system to work, we need to have these 7 dimensions activated. And so it's interesting to look into each of these 7 dimensions. And we like to start with technology, because when you talk about transition, everybody's talking about technology as the first thing. So what are the engines? What are the fuels? How are you going to do it from a technical point of view? And I would say from the technical point of view, the industry has come quite far the last, say, 5 years. We have pretty good understanding now that we can manage the technologies in this. There's still work to be done on some of the areas, and I'll get back to what that is. But actually on the technology side, it's no longer the most urgent one to solve in our industry. If you look at port and bunker infrastructure availability, there's also been a good deal of development, so we can start to see how ports and bunkering are going to take place. This is going to be a bottleneck when we do this upscaling, because many of the ports are in city environments. Many of these new fuels are very toxic. And like we heard about this morning, there's going to be a public resistance to actually making this implementation. Imagine having, 10,000 tons of ammonia in the middle of a city. There'll be a lot of resistance to this. So we're looking at some potential barriers here from the public acceptance side. Sustainable energy and fuels, as the next one, is not available today at all. And it's very much back to the presentations we heard, the presentation from GNO, for example, this morning. that the world doesn't have enough renewable energy today. A region like Europe, for example, is struggling just to feed itself with renewable or clean energy. So how would a region like Europe produce fuels for shipping in this context? Maybe it will. I'm not saying it will not, but I'm saying that a lot of regions are actually looking at energy security rather than being exporters of energy to international shipping. But then you have also, as we saw this morning, regions like Africa, Australia, etc., that could actually become exporters of energy. So there are some interesting things there, but this is one of the bottlenecks and the barriers to our industry, that this piece is not scaling, and it's difficult to see how it will be scaling at sufficient speed anytime soon. Then we get to the business side and the customer pull and the funding and financing. And here I would particularly like to mention the customer pull. So this is our willingness to pay for the green solutions. Back to the Christmas picture in the beginning. I mean, if we had had the option to pay 4 or 5 times or even 50% more for the iPhone or whatever is under the Christmas tree, would we actually do it? And the hard, cold reality today is that there is very, very limited customer willingness to pay. You can find small pockets here and there, maybe some of the electric vehicles going from Japan and Korea to Europe, maybe they will actually pay for it because customers are expecting a low carbon footprint of an electric vehicle. That's why we buy it, to be climate cautious. But if you look at most of the materials being transported, it's actually not the case. So there's definitely something there where you can say that the world has not really come together yet and mobilized these green supply chains. So again, the stuff we are buying is not sort of offered to us from a green supply chain perspective. So that's unfortunately not the case. There's less, I would claim, than 1% of the customers today that are willing to pay for green transportation. So then we are actually up at the regulation and policy side, where it is evident that public sector needs to play a key role. Oh, sorry, I thought I had more time. Okay, but then we are up to that one. I'll talk a little faster then. So regulation and policy is going to be a key one. Then I'll say a little bit about what our center is doing, because we were put in place to establish a collaboration in the ecosystem. And the basic idea of this was, can we bring parties together to create the visions of the future and talk about the pathways, how to get there, and then use this understanding to address some of the barriers in the system? Would that be possible? That's the journey we started 5 years ago. And we got about 1 billion kroner, norske kroner, to start this experiment, if you will, to develop a collaboration platform to get this going. And so here we are today, 4 years after we started the center, and it turns out that a lot of companies in the ecosystem liked this idea and supported us in this journey. So today we have a lot of organizations, and we have 150 people in the office in Copenhagen, where 70 are employed by the center, and 70 have moved in from Germany and US and Japan to work on the vision and on the concrete solutions and standards that will enable this. And you can see the partner portfolio here. And I am glad today to say that Equinor is a very, very important partner of ours, and also NTNU is a very important partner of ours. So we've established a very strong portfolio of companies, of governments, of NGOs, of universities that want to do this on a collaboration platform. And what we're doing is that we are working we have 50 projects today where we work with these partners in demonstrating energy efficiency. So that's the first one. We work on regulation and new business frameworks. We work on transforming the energy system. So that's on demonstrating new technologies, working, for example, on new standards on how you certify the new fuels. We work on getting it going. We call that the green corridors. So that's to find the businesses and the governments that are willing to invest in this and get it going. So that's the initiation there. And then on creating an upscale demand. So that is about policy and regulation. So here we're working a lot with governments, with IMO, with EU, and to inform them about what does good regulation look like. And right now we have very, very concrete conversations about these IMO regulations because they are really becoming real now. We will get a global fuel standard that will drive the climate impact of international shipping down. So knowing that I only have maybe 1 or 2 minutes left, maybe I'll just show you a few of the things we're working on. And I'd like to give you this overview about fuels and technologies. Because on this slide here, we're trying to illustrate the different fuel options. And we agree very much to what was said this morning, that there will be multiple options in the future. And particularly right now, we're looking at ammonia as a future fuel, methanol, methane, and some of the oils and diesel oils and so on. So that's on the vertical axis here. And then we've tried to illustrate here how mature are these pathways. And if you take the top one with ammonia, that's an extremely interesting pathway because it doesn't need carbon, so it is very scalable, and it is potentially highly sustainable also. But ammonia is highly toxic, so there are a number of elements in this one that need to be managed from a safety and environmental point of view. Methanol is the next one, and that is pretty mature, so it's a little difficult to scale it and get the cost levels down, but it's quite mature actually. Methane, a lot of ships, almost 1,000 ships are in the water today running on LNG, and they can run on biomethane and e-methane as well. That's a very well-established regime in terms of safety and operations. And finally, some of the oils are readily available. You can just drop them in and use them with existing technologies and practices. So you see we're looking at an option space here which is quite mature and where we believe over the next 3 or 4 years we will actually be able in our industry to scale this up once the regulation, once the demand is there. So this is our map of the green corridor work we're doing now. And as you can see, we're trying here to work with also the so-called Global South in trying to understand how do we make this transition, not only so it's solving the climate issue in a techno-economic way, but also in a way where we get an involvement from developing countries to possibly be producers of fuels to the transition, to create workplaces, to create social growth in developing countries. So this brings me to an end, and I would basically claim that international shipping has come from being a so-called hard-to-abate sector, where many said, we are last in line, we can't do it, it's too difficult, to having a lot of visibility of the fact that it is possible to do it. There is regulation shaping up that can drive our industry forward. There seems to be global consensus that we should do it, as maybe the first industry sector in the world. And the options, the technology options, are actually starting to emerge together with some new business models for how the business is going to drive this forward. So that's really fascinating. The other thing I wanted to say is that from our point of view, this ecosystem collaboration, where academia and NGOs and industries and governments come together to create the visions and also develop the concepts and the standards that will enable us to go there, holds a lot of potential. And I know many of you are doing similar things, and we just want to promote this idea of these collaboration platforms to be a very strong instrument to drive these needed global sustainability developments. So I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. My question was, You haven't mentioned anything about the EU carbon permits and if that affects the shipping companies.
Yeah. EU is playing an extremely important role in this in the regulatory space, and the EU regulation is making a big difference to definitely to intra-Euro EU trading, but also to international trading. But I would almost say even more so, it is inspiring and driving IMO to make very solid global regulation. So a lot of the things that are happening in IMO now is strongly inspired by what is happening in the EU. The big developments in EU was that shipping, international shipping, was included in the emission trading scheme. And this means that ship owners get now a kind of a carbon tax, which definitely makes a difference to ship owners. So we see concrete investments, concrete changes in the way ships are being bought, and the way fuel is being sourced today on the basis of that. And the other one is this fuel for maritime regulation, which is regulating the fuels of shipping and basically diminishing the climate impact over a number of years. And this basic idea of having a carbon pricing mechanism and a fuel standard that takes the climate impact down to zero is being adopted by IMO. So the same kind of principles are being implemented in the IMO. But of course, it's much more difficult for the IMO, being a global institution, to get a carbon pricing in place. From a political point of view, that's very difficult. But the fuel standard principle will be adopted in the IMO. That's quite certain. Yeah.
We did have one more.
Yeah, thank you. Impressed. But a question, you did mention nuclear power plant for vessel. At least in Norway, I understand there is some research going on there. Have you some comment on that or solution there?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I didn't have time to talk much into sort of the longer term solutions. We actually in IMO, we call these the short-term measures. That's the energy efficiency measures. The mid-term measures are the new fuels measures, and nobody really knows what the long-term measures are. But we see a lot of developments in the nuclear space, possibly enabling it to become a part of the solution from 2035 or something like that, hardly anytime sooner. And the main challenge is probably going to be on the regulatory side and the public acceptance side. But it all depends on what happens on land, because some of these small modular reactors, they are being developed now, and I guess if they are gonna be in operation around 2030, as many claim they are, and there are safe, you can say, statistics and good experience with these modular reactors, maybe they could play a role on certain corridors. It's hard to imagine that you would begin to have nuclear reactors all over, but you could imagine you could start to have nuclear reactors on certain routes that could actually take a lot of CO2 emissions out just by focusing on, let's say, 2 countries managing this very well. So there are, you can say, pathways to including nuclear into the mix, but I don't think anybody believes it will be, you know, a switch like that and we're done. So that's how there's a lot more to be said about the financing and the regulation, but that's the short answer.
Okay, we have to move on. Thank you again, Bo.
Yeah.